The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the October Community IT Innovators webinar series. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss guidelines for annual IT budgeting. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the President and CEO of Community IT. As always, we encourage you to interact with us by asking questions via the GoToWebinar chat feature, and we do our best to answer all questions during the webinar. You can also connect with us on Twitter, and we can be followed at at Community IT, and we'll be tweeting throughout the webinar today. We also have a number of questions that were submitted prior to the webinar during the registration process, and we will do our best to address those questions today. Just a reminder to avoid multitasking during the webinar. You may just miss the best part. If you do miss the best part, or if you need to leave the webinar early, we'll be posting links to the recording and slides on our website and follow up with an email to you. In case you're not familiar with Community IT, our skilled and certified team of IT professionals serves the greater Washington nonprofit community, helping organizations of all sizes and capacities to advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're deeply invested in the nonprofit community. We've served over 900 nonprofits since 1993, and we take a strategic and collaborative approach that fits the unique needs and culture of nonprofit organizations. And now, it pleases me to turn over today's webinar to our presenters, Steve Longenecker and Cedric Boyd, who will now introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Steve Longenecker. I'm the Director of IT Consulting at Community IT, and I'm looking forward to sharing this webinar with you all today. Cedric?
Yep. Hello, my name is Cedric Boyd, and I'm the Network Manager for Community IT. Likewise, I'm glad to be here, and look forward to going through all the information with you. Okay. So today we're going to be covering the main question of why, what are some reasons behind budgeting. Also, we'll review some methods for categorizing line items in your budget. We'll also take a look at 3- and 5-year budgeting, as well as review some questions that will kind of help the guide of the budgeting process. Lastly, we'll check out some sample budgets. So let's go ahead and get started.
Great, thanks, Cedric. So the first question we said we would tackle is why we budget in the first place. And sometimes the answer is simply because you have to. We do have clients who are organizations that are very strict about following their budgets. Basically they make a budget at the beginning of the year, each department does, and you can't go over your budget unless it's some emergency situation. And without an IT approved budget, there's not any IT spending. Often, though, actually, organizations that are clients of ours are much more looser about that, and it's more like the way my household works, where if there's a spending opportunity that presents, we sort of check our checkbook balance and decide whether we can do it or not in sort of an ad hoc kind of fashion. And actually, that works pretty well for our household, where there's two decision makers, and we can talk everything out. Even in those kind of loose organizations, though, we do think that doing a budgeting process can be a very useful exercise, and we encourage our clients to have IT budgets. It's an opportunity to sort of step outside the day-to-day operations and take a look at big picture things, anticipating changes that might be coming in the organization, thinking about what opportunities there are for IT investments. It's also an important time when there is an organizational budget process to develop agreements about what priorities the organization has in terms of IT investments. So when it comes time to spend $15,000 on something, if it's in the budget, that's a short way of saying we talked about this a lot in a planning process. We talked about the other choices that we could make with this $15,000, whether it was on IT or on something else, and we made a commitment at that time to spend it on this. And so we've already developed a consensus on this. We should be able to move ahead with it. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that you want to be ruled by your budget, where you can't make decisions that, things that happen after the budget is made later on in the year that change the landscape. Something else, the money should be spent on something else or whatever. I don't advocate that you lock things in, but the budgeting process is a chance for everybody in the leadership of an organization to sort of come to some consensus. And part of that consensus is to actually look at the IT's budget in the larger context of the organization. So that's sort of the short version of the fact that we do think that budgeting creates a lot of value for our clients, and we do appreciate our clients that spend the time to do some planning and do some budgeting on an annual basis.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. So when preparing your budget, of course, the main aspect of creating the budget is organization. How these line items are going to fit all together and really kind of give you a full picture of your budget. So in creating the budget, grouping some items using categories helps with understanding the context of each line item, while some items in theory would fall under more than one category. Being consistent in the organizing is what's most important. So let's take a kind of a closer look as to the different types of organizational methods. So under some different categories that can be used in working with your budget, of course, can be around personnel. Essentially, being able to really list down and on the line item exactly how much each personnel is going to essentially cost for the organization. For specific roles even in regards to IT, as we're on that scope, network administrators or even engineers, certain roles such as IT managers, database administrators, so on and so forth. The main thing that we don't want to forget when considering personnel is, of course, any kind of additional trainings or even certifications or even conferences that they may go to when kind of pulling together that overall number. Besides the salary itself, other things that we want to include even like health benefits, for example. Not just the salary, but all the other things that kind of encompass the overall cost for the salary. Moving forward, the hardware is another category that can be used, and it's kind of self-explanatory. But some examples are servers or switches, peripherals such as printers, even desktops, laptops, firewalls, so on and so forth. Along with the hardware cost, there's the kind of the residual cost of installation, as well as maintenance contracts and warranties. When reviewing software, software such as Microsoft Office, Blackbaud, or even Adobe software can really kind of, as something where you can pay it up front, or it could be, even subscription based. Lastly, and we're kind of another example of category can be services. Consulting or even outsourced IT support can kind of fall under that, as well as managed service providers such as community IT. And and when looking at other additional services, even like cloud-based backups, all of these kind of go into the cost of what cost under services. So, like any human effort, at categorizing, there can be some overlap again that can take place in these different areas. For example, if you have a new finance system and pay a consultant to help you do the implementation, do you put that consultant's time in the software category with the cost of the finance system's licensing, or in the services category? Not important. It's not really important to us which one you choose, but it's very important to be consistent across your budget from year to year. Another example, real briefly, is one around software as a service, such as Office 365. Is it a software, or is it even an actual service? Again, it's not really important to us, but consistency is what's imperative.
So another way of categorizing the line items in a budget, and this is not this is not in place of the categories that Cedric was just talking to, but sort of another level of categorization. So you might have a line item and it might be a hardware item, and you put it in that. And if I just want to add one thing to what Cedric said. I find that sort of having that system of categorizing, one of the values that it has is it just gets you, it sort of expands your thinking. So when you think about, well, what am I spending on IT? Writing the word hardware and saying, okay, what are my hardware things, just helps you sort of break it down so that you don't miss things, because it is possible to forget sometimes. So you get to services and you think, oh, that's right, I have service on my copier, and then where do I want to capture that? Is that in the hardware or in the service? So another way to categorize the line items is this framework that came to us from a friend of Community IT's, Danny Shimamoto, who did a guest webinar actually on IT budgeting some years ago for Community IT. He's a consultant that works with a lot of nonprofits and has actually written quite a bit about this. So he did not come up with this framework. This framework, I think, might have come out of the Gartner Group, which does a lot of research and consulting in our sector. This run, grow, and transform idea. So the idea here is that your different IT expenses can be categorized as being part of sort of the running of the organization, which is sort of your day-to-day operational costs. It does include, it's keeping the lights on. It does include, replacing things that need to be replaced because they've gone through their life cycle, but it's just sort of like part of your operational expenses, your day-to-day business is that when a server gets to be 5 years old or a laptop gets to be 5 years old, you need to put a new laptop in, you do that. You're just keeping things going. Another category is growing, and in this case, we're talking about introducing new capabilities or improving on existing ones. So the simple, basic example of this that's in the hardware room, hardware realm, and so it would be a hardware expense, but it's also a grow expense, is I'm going to be replacing these desktops that are 5 years old, but I'm going to be putting 2 monitors on each desktop instead of just 1, because this is going to allow my users to have more screen real estate. I've read studies that say that they're going to be more productive if they have more space to look at things when they're moving things around and copying and pasting from different documents and so on. So that would be sort of a grow thing. It's not like you're changing dramatically your operational workflows or anything, but you're adding to what already exists. And of course, then that leads to the last category, which you can it's sort of self-explanatory what we're talking about. This is kind of your research and development, your R&D type investments. And the idea here is that you're going to actually use IT to transform the way things are done. And this is sort of, where people like Cedric and I get excited, because we like the idea that IT might transform our clients' ways of doing business. And this is hard. These kind of initiatives are usually more than just plopping some IT into a new space, but actually working on change management, doing pilot, practices to see if it takes hold. So there might be a lot of different examples of this, but I'm thinking of things like maybe replacing an old file server with SharePoint as a file collaboration platform, where you do more than just put files in folders and open them and close them and so on, but that actually there's workflows built into the way the files are handled, and search and discovery is totally different. So this is what transform means. So this is another way of categorizing the line items that you would find in your budget. Cedric, you want to take this next slide and talk about another way of looking at that same idea?
Sure, Steve. So basically, as Steve was saying, going off of that the run is essentially always necessary. However, the grow and transform, again, are by nature, more optional. You know, we need to really kind of critically evaluate and think about the return on investment, you know, as we consider which one of these initiatives we might want to invest in, are our actual highest priorities, and which of these actual will be nice to have, but you know, but of course could be deferred to a later time. You know, especially if grants or donations or whatnot just don't really materialize. So you know, when finances are tight, transform initiatives are often the first things to be cut or even deferred, unless of course that they're associated with key strategic initiatives that overall the organization views as being essential to continued operation. So you know, even if the organization doesn't really deem certain transform initiatives immediately essential, you know, we should still kind of take care when considering cutting or deferring those items. You know, that's mainly because transform initiatives are really key to the organization's long-term health, and failure to provide adequate resources to the transform initiatives can of course stunt the organization's future success. Again, you know, a friend of community IT's Danny Shimamoto called the run, grow, transform categories. He kind of referred to those as run, optimize, and innovate. And you know, that's really kind of a good take on that, is again to kind of think of those as the grow as a way to optimize what you currently have, and again the transform, really kind of thinking in advance as to any kind of further initiatives that the organization may want to shift over to.
So this slide versus the slide on the other that we just looked at with the run, grow, transform matrix idea, and this slide versus necessary versus nice to have, I think shows like the two sides of the coin that we're talking about. Oftentimes when clients ask us, you know, what do you think we should do with our network in the next, 1 to 3 years, we list a bunch of things, and we sometimes put them in categories of these things are necessary, you have to do these things, and these are the things that we think are nice to have. And that's a shorthand for ways of thinking about things. And the risk, I think, of using those categories, of using the categories that we're looking at right now, I think it's appropriate sometimes, but I think there's a risk to it, which is, particularly in the nonprofit sector, I think there's a reluctance to give ourselves too many nice to have things. And I think of, like, the exposés on the nonprofits that are, supposed to be feeding hungry children, but the hidden camera goes into their office and it turns out they're using your donation dollars to have fancy Friday lunches for the staff, every Friday, and you should see this buffet that the staff has, and, it's terrible. And so we don't want to do nice, we need to do the necessary things, and the rest of our dollars need to go into programs. I think that's been an approach that I think it's a cultural approach that some organizations have. I think even community IT has it, since its roots, are not that different from our nonprofit clients' roots. The risk of that is that the nice to have things are also the grow and transform things. And if you're never investing in grow and transform, Danny Shimamoto says, look at your ratio between grow and transform and run, because if it's all run, that means you're not investing in growth and transformation. You're not allowing yourself to become something different than you are now, and that's probably not a good long-term approach, or not a good long-term strategy. I think this is a good way of categorizing things. I think we need to be careful with it, though. So that's the story on that. This slide is another way of also talking about sort of the same thing. So we're spending a lot of time on this idea of, how we make priorities, really. So run, grow, transform, necessary, nice to have. Here's another way of sort of looking at these things. This is something that actually came from our Chief Technology Officer, Matt Eshelman, here at Community IT. So this is a number of years ago. I remember him showing this to a group of us that were talking about some of the priorities that we were looking at for our own company. And so he had put all the initiatives that we were considering into a spreadsheet, and this is actually a chart that Excel generated for him. I don't think it was all that crazy what he did. I think it was a pretty couple clicks in Excel did this for him. But the size of the circle on this chart indicates in his estimation of the amount of time that the initiative would take. So we're talking time equals money. So we're talking about a cost there. So the size of the circle is the cost. And then he put urgency on one what's the word I'm looking for, on one line up and down, and then importance on the other horizontal line, and gave each a value of how important it was from 1 to 100 or whatever, and how urgent it was from 1 to 100. And of course, this is an old story, but it is a mistake to confuse importance and urgency. They're not the same thing. The example that I like to use for this is, there's a laptop, a shared laptop that's sitting in a cabinet most of the time, and it's been around for 7 years now, and it's on its last legs. Half the time when you boot it up, you get some error. You have to hit any key to get through, and you just know one of these days this laptop's going to die. In fact, replacing this laptop, if it's not going to die, is urgent. It could happen tomorrow. It's that bad. But it's not important at all. Really, the laptops gets used by the interns to take notes in the meetings, and my apologies to any interns that are in the audience right now. I'm sorry. I sometimes use interns as shorthand for not important, but that's probably not right. But you get my idea. There are other things that are important, and I think maybe of something like a community IT, we'd like to redesign our website sometime here soon. We think that's a reflection on who we are. We know that potential clients look at our website, and if it's kind of has an old look to it, that probably hurts our first foot forward kind of thing. I mean, I don't think it's the most important thing, but I think it is important. But it's not urgent. If we don't do that in the next 6 months, it's not going to kill us. It needs to happen. It is important, but it's not urgent. So when you plot these things out, you want to look at the things in the upper right, which are both important and urgent. And then, of course, how much time or cost it's going to be influences also how you prioritize these things. And just the next slide here is just the actual spreadsheet, just showing where this came from. And so it really wasn't that much work to put all these different ideas. And now we're talking about project initiatives more than we're talking about sort of the keeping the lights on kinds of things. So this is stuff that would fall into the grow and transform categories. But how you choose what you're going to do in terms of growing and transforming is is something that you might be able to look at with that kind of a perspective.
All right. So in really kind of talking about, we've gone through multiple categories or way of kind of categorizing these line items. The last thing that we were going to really kind of touch on is, of course, the different types of expenditures and how that can be used as a type of categorization as well. Of course, this is probably one of the more most important areas. This is kind of we receive lots of questions around capital expenditures versus operational expenditures, and so so I just want to kind of talk about that, where the capital expenses are technically defined as expenses related to investments that will deliver dividends beyond the fiscal year. Investments in hardware or software often fall into this category. Operating expenses, of course, are expenses related to the day-to-day business processes, which include, subscription services, staffing compensation, maintenance costs, and so on and so forth. Those are the main ones that you will more often than not will appear in the operating expenses. The project expenses, of course, are more so geared around special initiatives and have kind of a relatively short duration. There is kind of a dedicated start and stop time to any kind of project expenses or expenditures, and the cost for the project is sometimes capitalized, but not always.
it's interesting to note at this point in terms of capital versus operating expenses that we've noticed that for a number of our clients, and our clients are nonprofits, it seems that there's a reluctance to let the operating expenses get. If you have a choice, there's an interest in having things happen in the capital expenses more than in the operating expenses category. So some things have to be operating expenses by their very nature, and some things have to be capital expenses by their very nature. But sometimes there's opportunities to choose, and it does seem like our clients lean towards capital expenses versus operating. And I think that's because that's the nonprofit world, and it's sort of a special thing about the nonprofit world as compared to for-profit business. My impression of that has to do with the fact that I think for a long time, going back to that idea of those, the crazy Friday lunches and how awful that is that staff, have nice Friday lunches when, they should be spending money on programs. I think, historically and even today, nonprofits are evaluated on sort of how lean they are operationally in terms of overhead spending compared to what they're spending on actual program stuff that's delivering the results that they're supposed to be delivering. That for that reason, you can put this stuff in capital expenses, and the kinds of things I'm thinking of that like sort of seem funny to us sometimes, but make sense in that context. We had recently a client that wanted to get a subscription-based backup from us. We have our own managed backup that is paid for monthly, but they said, look, can we get that service from you, but we'd like to pay for it, for 3 years, and that way we can capitalize that expense the way we would if we bought a big expensive backup device. Otherwise the backup device looks attractive to us because that's a capital expense. If you're gonna force us to pay monthly for this managed backup service that we otherwise like a lot, we like this that you're offering it, but we just don't want to spend that, add to our operational budget. And so we were flexible with that, as we try to be with our clients. So that became a capital expense for that client, even though it is generally for us pitched to clients as a monthly subscription service. So it's interesting. I don't know if that's. I think it would be more on the nonprofit finance people who might have more to say about that than we do, because we tend to be sort of neutral about whether things should be capital or operating expenses. More of an accounting thing, but it is noteworthy.
Very good point, Steve. So when kind of organizing and using these methods, such as categorizing along with the run, grow, transform framework, and understanding the expense types of capital, operating, or project, those expense types, it really kind of helps in developing a clear and concise budget aligned with organizational IT goals. When planning a budget, however, organizational IT goals may and should extend past the upcoming fiscal year. So let's go ahead and take a look ahead past next year.
Right. So this is sorry. So let me get side. This is sort of another point now. So we've talked about categorizing all the different line items. So now we don't have any extra slides on this in this one, but we really want to emphasize that this is an important thing to think about when you're putting together a budget for IT. And I think this probably applies to budgeting for any department. But for IT, budgeting for this just for the year ahead does not begin to capture sort of the roadmap that you need to have when you think about your expenses. This is just one small example. It's a firewall purchase. But if you think about a firewall in terms of a 5-year budget, you begin to really see that that this is something that has you may capitalize the expense, and that's fine, but you should think about this in terms of, this is something that I'm going to use for 5 years, and I need to think about how I'm paying for it in 5-year increments, because otherwise I get the wrong impression about how this firewall works. So in 2016, I'm buying a new FortiGate 60D. I'm buying a maintenance support contract for it because that's very important. The maintenance support contract is not as long as the life cycle of the firewall, or the hoped for life cycle of the firewall. So a couple years later, I have to extend, or I choose to extend that contract. But 5 years later, I need to buy that a replacement for that 60D. Maybe it's called a 60F at that point. We don't know. In many ways, I think you could push back and say, hey, what are you talking about? You're planning for 2020? Who are we kidding? I mean, technology changes so much. Will there even be firewalls in 2020? And I think that's a valid question. And I think I've seen plenty of budgets, even, I've seen budgets that we've put together for our clients that only go out 3 years, and I think that's reasonable. We choose 5 as our default because that is kind of the longest life cycle that we think of for most service contracts. I think most service contracts are 3 years or less, but there might be a 5-year service contract for some things. And then we think of the life cycle of most hardware as being 5 years or less. So if you put down 5 years, you're going to see the overall cost of any line, in its entirety, rather than sort of missing the costs. Like, if we don't have a 5-year view of this, 2016, it's pretty evident we need to buy a firewall, but in 2017, you don't even have the firewall listed because it's blank. So if you just do a year-by-year thing, you give your 2017 IT budget into your ED, and there's no firewall listed because you don't need to buy a firewall that year, and there's no cost associated with it, and it sort of gets forgotten that no, really this firewall is costing our organization money every year in an accounting capitalized expense. It's just not a cash out the door expense in 2017 and 2019. But really, every year we need to think about the fact that we are using a firewall, and that firewall has a cost associated with it. It's just not paid for, month by month the way some expenses are.
Thanks, Steve. So, we'll definitely take a look at some sample budgets on that note to kind of show, the ways of kind of bringing together the categorization, and then also extending the look ahead for the budget. But when compiling this, the budget, really we have to again kind of ask ourselves, what are we really looking at when compiling this budget? What are some things that we need to really ask ourselves? So here in front of you, you see kind of some questions that we have kind of listed out. I'm of course not going to go through each one, but I did want to kind of just highlight a few and some additional thoughts to those to help kind of guide your questioning or your review process when kind of creating the budget. So one thing I want to highlight is actually the first question. Is my organization growing or shrinking? That's something to really consider. Something that may actually kind of go outside of your day-to-day scope, but it's really something that really needs to be thought about long term. For example, are you going to be expanding offices or expanding the floors, moving to a larger office, and how that's really going to impact your organization as well as your budget. Also, are you downsizing? Are there some internal departments that might be merging together? But how is that going to affect your organization and your budget planning? Another question that I just want to kind of highlight that's listed here is what is my organization's tolerance for risk, such as downtime and potential IT, for any kind of IT failure. This is important to really kind of think about because this will guide decisions for planning, for example, a robust backup system, or even shifting some services into the cloud to improve the availability of your staff that might be working remotely or just outside of the office. These are things to kind of think about long term. Lastly, another question I want to highlight is what are IT pain points for your organization? This kind of goes back to the point why budget in the first place? Budgeting allows you to plan for improvements that can be made in the future, really to kind of help prevent pain points in your organization. So, yep, so I'm sure, Steve may just kind of go ahead and dive into this, but as mentioned, next we're going to really kind of take a look at some of these, some sample budgets and, and see how all the things that we've kind of talked about really go into the budget. And so go ahead and kind of take it away, Steve.
Sure. So we have three screenshots or clips or whatever from budgets, and to some extent we're a little, I don't know, handicap's not quite the right word, but we're obviously can't show you an entire budget from one of our clients because it's proprietary information. It's information that belongs to our clients. In these cases, we've just given you small pieces that we think it's okay, and we've made sure there's no identifying information in them. So we'll just point out some highlights on these things. On this one, I wanted to point out the 5-year things across here. It's running from 2016 up to 2020. Notice the line that has a little green above it that shows the staff training, and that says. Oh, I should mention here. This is organized by Run, Grow, and Transform. There's quite a bit above above what we're seeing here that is cut off. So above laptop replacement is rows and rows of other things that are all part of Run. Run's on this budget is by far the largest category. In fact, this budget pulls out the percentages, which is one of the things that Danny Shimamoto does recommend that you do. So in this case, for 2016, 7% of the total budget for IT is in Grow and 9% is in Transform, and in 2017 it's 14% in Grow and 0 in Transform. So that means that we're looking at this. This is an organization that, on average, is between 15 and 20% of its budget is headed towards Grow and Transform. Danny Shimamoto, he talks about there not being a correct or best ratio for that. I don't think he would say that 85 to 15 for Run versus Grow Transform is a bad ratio or a good ratio. I think it depends on sort of constraints at a particular organization and culture and a lot of different things. But it is something to note that you sort of keep track of who you are and you ask yourself on a regular basis, are we investing enough in things that are going to do more than just sort of maintain the status quo? So on that staff training, there's $25,000, $30,000 a year for things on, and this is a larger organization that we're looking at here, so that's a lot of money, I know. Well, it depends, but it probably is a lot more of a bigger training budget than some of our smaller clients would have. It's not itemized, and I think that's typical. You just sort of identify a number and do your best to say, look, we know we want to keep our staff, up to speed on that they have professional development, that they are always growing and getting better, and so we're going to earmark some money for that, and we'll, as opportunities present themselves in the upcoming years, we'll know that we have that money set aside. In the Transform, the person who put this budget together even put those line items in a different color and put in the notes section brainstorming. These are like, wild ideas in some ways, maybe, or maybe not that wild, but it's just kind of like, look, we need to think about things that are going to make us, different and better in how we do things operationally. And I'll definitely note that there's nothing budgeted for more than 2 of these initiatives in any one year, and most of the time it's just one initiative in a given year, and some years none at all. And I think that's wise budgeting. Even if there's money for it, To try to do too much at once is unlikely to have have good results.
Yep. So this.
Sorry.
Sorry about that. So this slide here essentially is covering it's another look at another sample budget. However, this one is a more in-depth look, a closer look at specifically the equipment category of the runs section. One second. So this is, again, I'm sorry, the equipment section, or we are looking at the equipment category of the run section of the overall budget. Here, of course, this is a run, grow, transform budget again, and the contract, essentially we have some additional rows here, such as contract term and additional notes and assumptions that really kind of help us get a more in-depth look at each one of these line items. So we'll kind of just look right here at the top, where the workstation replacement, of course, doesn't have a specific contract term. However, under the notes and assumptions, we see that it kind of highlights that we're estimating about $1,500 per unit, and we're going to be replacing 34 replacements workstations in 2016, another 19 in 2017, 4 in 2017. I might be looking at that incorrectly, but the goal here again is to really kind of be able to implement as much information in order to really kind of give you a full picture of long term of what is going to be happening, or what your kind of assumptions and thoughts are when adding in a specific line item. The next slide that we'll show you is actually a full, kind of taking a look at a different approach to the budgeting. In this one, we're actually using the capital expenditures, operating costs, and and then we have included the project expenditures under the capital expenditures. So you'll see here that we started, at the top under capital expenditures. We have the categories of network hardware, the server upgrade project, which is the project expenditure that has been capitalized, as well as workstation replacements and software. The main things I want to really kind of show you here again is the different way that we categorized it using, again, the capital expenditures and operating costs, as well as the fact that, this is, again, a kind of a 3-year budget with specific, hardware categories, so on and so forth. Steve, I'm not sure if you have any other things that kind of stand out to you here that may be helpful for everyone to know.
No, I think that you've covered it very well, Cedric. Thanks.
All right.
So, so we've talked about we looked at 3 different examples of budget. We've talked about all the different categories and everything. This is sort of the end of our presentation. We do have a bunch of questions queued up, but I think before we even get to that, Johan, you want to talk about the next upcoming webinar?
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. So our upcoming webinar in November is going to be a deep dive into Office 2016. So as most of you may know, Microsoft is in the process of releasing its next version of Office for both the Mac on OS X as well as for Windows. And we're pretty excited about it. There's a lot of new and interesting features, particularly as they relate to Office 365 and storing and editing, accessing and collaborating on documents in the cloud. So it's a pretty significant change and update to the Office suite in 2016. And I've been using it for a while, been really happy with it. And it's something that we wanted to get into in more detail now that we've had a chance to play around with it. So Mark Kramer and Matt Eshelman are going to be, I think, probably doing some some demonstrations as well as reviewing some of the big features in Office 2016. A lot of you may be wondering, whether or not you should plan for upgrading to Office 2016 next year. And that's something that we also hope to kind of address and answer. And then, of course, if you do plan to upgrade, how do you roll it out effectively to your staff so that you don't have a lot of problems or run into a lot of issues. So excited about the webinar. It's going to be, as always, on the third Thursday of the month. It'll be November 19th from 4 to 5 o'clock. So with that being said, a few quick things. After the webinar, we send out an email with a link to a survey. We'd ask that you would respond to that survey. We've been doing this monthly webinar series now for, 2 or 3 years, and the survey results we get are always really helpful to us in improving the webinar series and making sure that it's meeting the needs of our audience. So please respond to that survey. If you did miss anything, the links to the slides as well as a recording are going to be emailed to you and posted on our website. And we encourage you to connect with us on Twitter, social media. We're active on all the main social media sites. So let's go ahead and move on to questions. If you haven't had a chance yet, please use the question tool, the chat tool in GoToWebinar to submit your question, and we'll answer it. So I've got a few questions for you, Steve and Cedric. And I'll just kind of run through these as they've come in. And some of them you touched on, but this is an opportunity to maybe elaborate on some of the things that folks were interested in. So the first has to do with capital expenditures versus operating expenditures. If you have a preference, of one versus the other, and then it specifically does leasing equipment, hardware and software, even if that's possible, does that have an impact on the budget in that regard?
I'll tackle this one. So I would say it's fair to say that from the IT side and the IT support side, which is the community IT side of things, we don't have a preference for operational versus capital expenses, or how you pay for things in terms of how you take care of them in the accounting side of things. As we said as I said in the main part of the webinar, we do see a preference for that capital expense amongst quite a few. I'd say the majority of our clients seem to have a preference for it, and I think that question about leasing is particularly notable in that way. I think as a for-profit business, which community IT is a for-profit business and doesn't have, it has a different set of constraints on it than a nonprofit would. We've looked at leasing for sure, and we do lease some of our server hardware that would traditionally have been a purchase, and that helps us with things like cash flow, and that there's reasons for doing that. I think there's a finance charge that makes that calculation complicated, and our CFO looks at all of that. But there have been times when we've done some leasing for cash flow reasons. Our preferred hardware vendor for servers and desktops is Dell, and Dell's sometimes very aggressive about offering leasing options. And with a few few exceptions, there are exceptions sometimes. I've been surprised at how little our clients have taken that opportunity. It just seems like capital expenses are what mostly nonprofit organizations prefer. And again, I think that goes back to that history thing we talked about history of how nonprofits are evaluated in terms of their effectiveness, in terms of how they use money wisely. I think sometimes also the question you mentioned, Johan, about development and fundraising. I think capital expenses are often easier to fundraise for also. So we do have occasions where a client comes to us and says, you've been talking to us about how we need to do this or need to do that, some big initiative, a big server replacement or something, and we definitely want to do it. We're going to fundraise for that. So maybe there's that's the focus of an annual dinner, or there's a specific grant that's being applied for that has to do with IT and empowerment or something, and and things are paid for that way.
Yeah.
But whether or not it's I think it's up to the finance people at the individual nonprofits to determine for themselves whether or not there's actually an advantage for them.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of
Johan, you
sense.
just cut out a little bit.
Sorry, and I would add that it's important to not let the tail wag the dog, and I think there has been a move in technology solutions over the last 5 years to the cloud, and that has sort of forced people to move software expenses and even some hardware expenses from being a capital expense to being an operating expense. So instead of having a big email server roll out every 5 years that could be capitalized, it's now spread out, over as an operating expense because you're essentially purchasing the software as a service. And it would be a huge mistake to stick with an on-premise email server because you can capitalize it, because there are a lot of technical reasons why that no longer makes sense. So I think I've noticed with nonprofits the need to get a little bit more creative in terms of how software as a service expenses sort of get allocated in the organization, and if there's a way to allocate them um, so that organizations have unrestricted funds that they can use basically for overhead, and oftentimes IT falls into that bucket. But for example, if the organization is using something like Salesforce for fundraising, maybe that can get, well, that's a bad example. If they're using Salesforce for their programs, maybe that can get allocated to program expense, which then it's a little bit easier to raise money for. So
That's a good example.
something to keep in mind. Next question. One of the listeners asked if there's any guidelines for how you scale costs to the size of the organization. Are there any rules of thumb for how much an organization should be spending on IT depending on their size?
Yeah, I think so.
Go ahead.
Sure. So I think Steve and I talked, had this actually came up in our discussion, but so that's actually a good question. There seems to be a lot of studies out there in regards to what the per person IT cost is and how it kind of relates to the size of the organization. But ultimately, it seems like it's still there is kind of a lot of variation around that, and it really has to do with differences, differences between certain businesses and business sizes. But one thing that I would like to at least kind of put out there is that kind of a smaller organization per se may have higher costs associated with individual person or per person, because there's not a lot of processes out there in order to try to to help automate, such as onboarding a new clients or new staff. But as you start to shift over to the larger organizations, they have processes that tend to be a little bit more automated, and therefore really kind of help to reduce the the cost associated with onboarding new staff. Additionally, while for example, of a kind of a firewall, where a smaller organization may use a firewall that costs a certain amount, and it is kind of geared to be best used on a staff size of, say, 1 to 15 or 1 to 30, and that device costs a specific amount. As we start to kind of look into the larger devices, those larger devices that may cost additional more money, may cost, have a higher price point, may actually allow you to, may be beefy enough to actually really kind of cover a larger, a larger size of organization. So I guess what I'm really trying to say and the takeaway from this is that, it doesn't really appear to be any kind of, ratio per se, but there are a lot of things that kind of go into, going into that number that ultimately shifts down to, how much really, how much, what the cost is per person in regards to IT. So, I'm not sure if there's other things to kind of add to that, but I mean, that's my sense in regards to this kind of the scaling cost per organization size.
I agree with that. I think that there are tipping points as organizations change their size that are important in terms of IT budgeting. When you're very small, I think it's hard to have any kind of in-house IT, and outsourced IT makes a lot of sense. I think as you grow, you get to a certain size where you start looking at in-house IT being more affordable because you're one staff person, which might have a fully loaded cost of, I don't know, I'm just going to pick a number, $80,000, $90,000, with benefits and everything else added, vacation time, all of that kind of a thing. And that person can serve 75, 80, 90, 100 people okay, and so it makes sense to have that person be in-house, whereas the outsourced time for that much, 40 hours a week, maybe it's more if it's outsourced. There are those tipping points, but I think overall, I think the more people you have, the per employee cost of IT probably varies more around things like, what line of business is the nonprofit in? If I think laptops cost more than desktops, so if you have staff that are out in the field, there's just maybe higher cost to supporting field staff than there is to supporting everybody in the same office, and so that impacts the per person spend more than the size necessarily. I think the culture of IT influences it more as well. I think there are similarly sized organizations that, and one is focused only on run, and so their costs might be lighter because they're just keeping the lights on and that's all they're trying to do, whereas another organization, similar work, similarly sized, but they're really focused on investing in grow and transform initiatives year after year, and they end up, they may be doing work in a better way as a result of that, but they're spending more money per employee. I know, and Johan, you can chime in on this, but I know that we charge basically a per seat for our services, for our all-inclusive services, because from our perspective, it's not that there's no differences as you scale, but that arithmetic still more or less makes sense to us, that supporting 20 people costs half as much as supporting 40 people, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, Steve. It kind of depends on the extent to which IT is